So you wrote an article called Fostering Responsibility in Your Sexual Relationship. Now, first of all, there's like a lot of like keywords in here, but I love the title for so many reasons. But one is this word responsibility in your sexual relationship. So tell us what inspired you to write this article, and I guess to title it this.
Yeah. So I think for me, I was noticing, like, I think working with couples who struggle with sexual issues, you kind of come face to face quite a bit with a lot of just really unhealthy myths around sex, sexuality, and sexual relationships, both for individuals and couples. And I kept running into these different myths that were kind of like ruffling my feathers. I was getting a little angry, like, at, if I can be perfectly honest, at some of these myths and how they can be really destructive for marriages, right? Like, I think sometimes, like, there's certain verses in the Bible or certain kind of cultural norms that have been imposed on sexuality in the church that I don't necessarily find to be the most helpful. And sometimes I can't find the verse that says that thing, but for some reason in the culture, we've kind of adopted it. And one of those things is the sense of like, don't deprive each other of sex, right? Like, there's that verse in the Bible that says, don't deprive one another of that, right? Unless by mutually agreed upon for a time for prayer. Okay? I'm completely butchering that verse. So people watching, I apologize. If you Google it, you'll find it. But I think sometimes that kind of morphed into this space where sometimes couples and relationships didn't feel like they had the ability to kind of listen to their own bodies in the context of their relationship and say, you know what, I don't think that that's okay for me right now, or what have you. And so it kind of became this thing where sex in a marriage was obligatory in some way. And so I think my heart in writing this was kind of to speak to those people who had those experiences of feeling like sex was obligatory, either like expecting that from a spouse or feeling like that's a demand that needs to be given, instead of allowing the sexual relationship to be a lot more mutual and free and safe. So that was kind of, I just really wanted to speak to the heart of some of those myths around sexuality and how that plays out in a marriage.
So good. And I love that that's like kind of the angle you're taking it from, is like some of those myths. Like, we can misunderstand or misinterpret maybe some things that scripture does give us instruction for sex, but there's also this piece of what feels safe and right in different moments. So if you could share with us, who is it that you wrote this article for?
I mean, I think I wrote this article for like anybody who has sexual urges or desires, right? I had written a previous article kind of more specific to like singles who are experiencing their sexuality and maybe feeling a little frustrated about that. Like, what do I do with this? How do I manage this? And this kind of felt like a follow-up piece for maybe couples who maybe are dealing with some of the myths and issues around that in their relationship, that sense of obligation on either side. So kind of really wanting to just speak to couples and that, and the importance of having that sense of responsibility over your own body's desires and urges.
That is so good. And I love that you said this is for everyone, because I pastor, in addition to being a part of the MCO team. I also pastor. And as I was reading the article, it was even helpful. I mean, yes, for me as a married woman, but as, oh my goodness, like, how am I teaching this in my context? So I would agree that it's super helpful for married couples, but it really is for everyone, because you really are helping to speak to some of these ideas that aren't necessarily true. Yeah. So in this article, you really do lean into the importance of having healthy sexual responsibility. So walk us through, what are some practical next steps for this?
Yeah. Yeah. So I think like when I'm talking about sexual responsibility, just to define that a little bit more, and then I'll get into the practical tips piece, but just the sense of like the sexual urges and desires that we have are good and from God,
Mm,
and that they're our responsibility to kind of manage, for lack of a better word,
mm,
right? That when we have a sexual urge or have that desire that kind of naturally comes forth inside of our bodies, that doesn't necessarily mean that that urge has to be met right then, or that
mm,
our spouse has to meet that urge or need just because we have it right then.
sure.
Right. So that sense of sexual responsibility is kind of speaking to how do we manage that in the context of a relationship, and how can that be maybe handled in a healthier way.
Mm,
And so I think in terms of practical tips, the first thing that I always like to encourage people is that those desires are so good and so healthy, right? And there's, I think, so much of why God wired that into us is because it points us to this desire for connection and closeness and intimacy with another person,
mm,
right? And so it's so, so good and so normal that those desires are there, right? And so part of that is just noticing that they're there, right?
mhm,
Paying attention to them, valuing them, and not like trying to squash them down if you are single, or maybe there isn't that sense of freedom and safety in the marriage, but just noticing them and acknowledging them and
mm,
accepting them as good and okay, right?
mm,
And then the next piece is maybe asking for that need to be met, right? It's a very invitational thing, right? If you are married and you notice that need, it's an invitation to a spouse, right? It's an invitation to a spouse, not an expectation,
ooh, that's good.
right? And so kind of allowing your spouse then to speak to that, to say like, yes, that sounds great, or you know what, I'm really exhausted, maybe later or tomorrow or something, right? That even if that is deferred or postponed,
Mm,
right? That to maybe like ask yourself the question of how else can I get a need for closeness met, right? So if maybe
mhm,
sexual intimacy isn't on the table for whatever reason at this time, how can we connect in other ways so I can still feel close,
mm,
right? Because that's that urge, that desire, that connection for closeness.
mm.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think even if you are single too, like what are healthy ways that you can get that intimacy need, that closeness need still met. Right?
Mhm.
And then I think on the practical side too is kind of diverting that energy into something else physical, like go for a run or do some yoga, kind of let your body release some energy in a way that's healthy and safe.
Mm,
Um, so kind of practically, I think that's what I would say.
yeah. But you already leaned into this a little bit, but if you wouldn't mind sharing more about healthy ways to manage a sexual urge when connection isn't possible.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's so hard. I think um, if sexual connection isn't possible, I think you would then move to like emotional connection,
Mm,
right? Because it is like that need for closeness is so good, and emotional intimacy can feel really connecting too, and can meet some of those needs, right? Like when we connect sexually, oxytocin is released in our bodies, and when we connect emotionally, oxytocin is also released in our bodies, right?
mm,
And so kind of if physical intimacy, if sexual intimacy isn't available for whatever reason, move into emotional intimacy and emotional connecting, right?
that's
Even
so
if your
good.
spouse isn't available, a good friend, right? That you can just like talk with or laugh with, that's like safe and that loves you and your partner, right? That you can kind of lean into that type of closeness too, because it's a signpost for all of the closeness. It's a signpost for all of the intimacy. Right?
Mm,
And then just making sure you're taking care of your body and still releasing that energy.
That is so good. And I love that you said it is a signpost for all the other connections. Like, yeah, if you can't connect sexually, like you can't be sexually intimate, how are you emotionally or relationally,
Mhm.
connecting to people or even spiritually connecting? That's
Yes.
another form of intimacy. So I love that. And I love that you're talking about this in like a really holistic sense that intimacy, we even say it like this. We're like, oh, I'm going to be intimate with my spouse, or we're intimate, and we chalk that up to sex. And
Mhm.
intimacy is so much far reaching than just sex. There's sexual intimacy, there's relational, emotional. So yeah, I
Yeah.
love that.
Yeah, because I think, I mean, like, how I understand God's heart for sex is just this really pure space of like two people bringing their whole selves into this moment where they're just like completely laid bare, right? In so many different ways. It's not just a physical act,
Mm,
right? And so maybe if we expand our just our thinking and our idea and our understanding of what sex is and what God designed it for, it
mm,
takes the pressure off of
yeah.
those moments where we are connecting sexually in this one specific way, right? It takes the pressure off of that when those urges do come up. It's like, I really just want to feel close to you. And if intercourse isn't the thing that can happen for whatever reason, like how can we still feel close?
Mm.
How can we still bring ourselves wholly together in a moment and have that place of connection?
Alison, that's so good. So, so, so good and so helpful. And the way that you're sharing it is so beautiful and so God honoring. So, what final piece of advice would you give to people who are listening or watching this conversation today?
Mhm. Yeah, I just want to say like um communicate with your partner, right?
Mm,
Be honest with yourself and about how you're feeling, right? And make sure that in the relationship that you're in, that you're really seeking to deepen intimacy on all the levels with your
mm,
spouse, not just sexually, that you're deepening that intimacy emotionally as well. Uh, so that when those urges come up, whatever the circumstances, it won't be a point of contention in the relationship. It can be something that spurs you on to growth and closeness, no matter what the outcome
mm. So good. Thank you so much for not only being a student of this, but a sharer of it, like bringing your wisdom, your knowledge, your your experience with couples and sharing it with us today and writing the article about it in the first place. So thank you.